Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today on Brave New World is Pippa Ehrlich, director and screenplay writer of the movie My Octopus Teacher. The movie was released during the height of the pandemic in the fall of 2020 on Netflix. It won the Best Documentary Feature Award at the Academy Awards the following year. My Octopus Teacher totally blew my mind. If you haven't seen it, all I have to say is Nike, as in just do it. Even if you have seen it, watch it again. Chances are you'll see something new. I did. Pippa, welcome to Brave New World. I am super delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Vasant. I'm very excited to speak to you. Thanks for thinking of me.
I just loved your film, and I've mentioned it in several of my episodes, including a recent one with Peter Singer. But I want you to just sort of go back and tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and ultimately how you found the project.
So, I'm South African. And I grew up in Johannesburg, which is a landlocked city in the middle of the country. And I remember finding that quite stressful. And many kind of December holidays, my family would come down to the beach, and often we came to Simonstown, which is where My Octopus Teacher was eventually filmed. So it's a place where I always felt at home. And I was always fascinated by animals and the natural world, but I guess I didn't really know that growing up as a kind of city kid. And I probably should have studied biology. But I only figured that out way too late in my university career. And I'd become a journalist. And I had this idea in my head that I was going to get my journalism degree and then kind of move to London and get a job in a newspaper, and that would be the world that I built. But I realized in my final year of studying that really what I was more interested in than anything else was nature. And I guess I spent the next 6 years of my life trying to mold my storytelling career so that I could be very, very involved in animals and the natural world. And I was really lucky that in my mid-20s, I got an incredible job with the Save Our Seas Foundation as a conservation journalist. So I was sitting online and talking to all of these really leading marine biologists in every corner of the globe. And I'd been freediving for a while, but I became quite a serious diver and free diver. And I just became increasingly obsessed, actually, especially with sharks. Sharks were our main thing. And sometime into that process, a mutual colleague took me diving with this guy called Craig Foster. And Craig is someone I knew because I'd always admired his films, but it was kind of, mind-blowing for me to actually meet him. And I'd been diving in the kelp forest for a very long time because I lived in Cape Town and we'd wear big, thick wetsuits. And I'd chase these huge 7-gill sharks, which are sometimes 3.5 meters, big predators. And we were very lucky. At one point, you could see 30 sharks on one dive. And they were very kind of ancient and scary looking, but also very, very docile. And they would sort of drift around you and drift over your head and past your face. And you never had to be worried about anything. They have recently disappeared. They've been chased out by a couple of orcas. And I found myself going into this very shallow bit of lagoon with Craig, with no wetsuit, and feeling quite sort of suspicious and confused about the whole experience. But within 10 minutes, I realized that he was seeing that environment at a level of detail that I could never have imagined possible. in about 20 minutes of diving, I saw more animals, and animals that I didn't even know existed, than I had seen in, I don't know, probably 7-8 years of freediving regularly in the kelp forest. It was like putting on a pair of magical glasses.
Now, when you say you were chasing those sharks,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I guess...
And to me, it sounds, to me, it just sounds terrifying. And so my sort of accompanying question to that is, do you just have, like, no fear?
No, I definitely have fear. But I was always going in with friends who were very experienced with sharks.
So you had that trust. So what did it mean when you said I was chasing these sharks?
I wasn't literally chasing them. It's a very exciting feeling to be in the water and surrounded by so many big animals like that. And they're so peaceful.
And were you freediving, or were you wearing a tank?
Normally I was freediving. Every now and again I would scuba dive, but normally for a work thing. If I was just going for fun, I would freedive.
Yeah, I found that there are sort of entire diving communities. I remember being in Tobago once, and there was this one part of the island that was just, it was just all divers. So it seems like a sort of subculture of its own.
It's a massive subculture in Cape Town, and it's growing. I mean, it's grown so much in the last 5 years.
You were talking about going into the shallow with Craig and noticing that you sort of saw things in a whole new way. Say more about that.
I mean, I guess I'd written stories about the kelp forest. I'd guided photographers around the kelp forest. I'd been paddling. I mean, I learned to swim, actually. The first day that I learned to swim, I was kind of paddling on a shallow beach surrounded by kelp and penguins. So it was a place I was very familiar with. But that first dive with Craig was just magical. As I said, within 20 minutes, we'd been like looking into the eyes of big octopuses and watching pajama sharks sleep in caves and seeing starfish having like slow motion battles with big sea snails, and the sea snails trying to get the starfish off and the starfish is chasing it. Big fish that can breathe air, and they've got a big sucker underneath their chin, and they can hold 3 times their body weight on a rock, and just things I'd never thought about before. And it was all so fascinating, and Craig was not only tracking to find where these animals were now, but he was looking at signs in the ocean that allowed him to kind of get a sense of what had happened before and what was going to happen next. And it felt like magic. It really did. In that moment.
It's like conjures up images of 20,000 leagues under the sea, except that this is like for real.
This is for real, and it's in 3 meters of water. You don't even have to hold your breath to see many of these things.
So is there something unique about people like Craig and yourself that sort of facilitates this connection with the wild? I don't even know how to describe it, right? But just some people just sort of have it when it comes to, understanding animals and, the extreme cases. But, is there something about people like that sort of establish this connection?
I think it takes kind of a voracious mind with unending curiosity. That's one thing. And I've met a few people like Craig, but it's having that incredible inquisitiveness, but also enormous self-discipline so that you channel and contain it. And when I started diving with Craig, it was actually very systematic. He kind of said to me, look, I'll teach you to track underwater. I'll teach you to find these animals. I'll teach you to connect like this. But there's a system and a set of rules. And the rules were you have to dive every day. You can't wear a wetsuit. You need to take a camera in with you. And you need to get the guidebooks, and you need to start identifying every single animal that you can find in this place, and you have to get to know them. Because only when you know what's there will you be able to tell what's interesting. Only when you know what's normal will you know what's special.
So why no wetsuit? What does that do?
Well, that's such an interesting question in many ways, because the water is freezing. I mean, I went for a swim this morning on the other side of the bay. There are 2 sides to Cape Town. And the side that Craig dives on is actually, at least in summer, it's the warmer side. The other side where I was this morning, it was so cold. It must have been about 8 degrees. Like my kneecaps were in agony within about 30 seconds. So I was very used to diving in a wetsuit, but it's so restrictive. I mean, I wore a wetsuit a couple of days ago for a dive, and I actually, after so many years of feeling so free in the water, I felt pretty nauseous. I think there's a sense of freedom that comes from not wearing a wetsuit. There's cold exposure is incredible for your body and your mind. It's been proven now to regulate our nervous system. So if you deal with anxiety, if you don't have enough dopamine in your system, whatever, it has a very, very powerful impact on the neurological cocktail in your brain. And that was something that I found because I'd especially at the time when I met Craig, I was really struggling with anxiety. And I found that being in that cold water immediately was like kind of just reset my nervous system for the day. Made me feel very calm and very focused.
Yeah, that's something you talk about in the film, where he says that it's brisk when you get in and you feel this cold, but then there's about 10 or 15 minutes of bliss, or you're sort of, you're in this zone, I guess, where you just feel different. So tell us a little bit about that. What does that feel like?
It feels like an intense experience of presence. So when it's cold like that, you really can't think about anything else. So it really brings you into the experience of what's happening to you right then and there. What are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you hearing? How's the light moving? What other creatures might be in that experience with you? And I think what that does is just stops all the chatter in your head, and that gives you incredible clarity. So if you apply that clarity and that spaciousness to a specific task, like taking photographs, tracking animals, moving carefully in the water so as not to disturb sharks or octopuses, you can do it at a very high level.
So there's a couple of questions I sort of want to follow up from there. One is sort of just more, how long do you actually stay down there?
The breath holding is not very long, and I'm very unfit at the moment. I mean, I would say an extremely long breath hold underwater is like 2.5 minutes. And often what we do, because we're working with animals that sit on the bottom, we often just put our camera down and leave it filming and then watch from the surface and go down and collect it later. And then when you're not wearing a wetsuit, it just depends how cold fit you are. There have been times where I could do 11 degrees for an hour and a half. At the moment, because I'm spending so much time in front of a computer and traveling, because I travel a lot now, it's hard for me to do 45 minutes.
2.5 minutes underwater sounds like a lot.
It's not so much. I think if you did some basic breath work, you would probably find that very quickly, lying on the floor, you could hold your breath for 4 or 5 minutes without too much stress.
So the other question I wanted to ask you was, have there been any sort of systematic trials, like, I don't know, I guess the best would be like random sort of controlled trials about this phenomenon, right? Where you can actually demonstrate that it, does wonders for depression, or the sort of, therapeutic effects of this immersion in, in that kind of cold, subjecting your body to that. Intuitively, it sounds like, yeah, it should invigorate your nervous system, but have there been any sort of systematic studies done that demonstrate this?
There have, and I don't want to misquote. So I think it might be something that is better left as a link at the bottom of the podcast, but I know Andrew Huberman has spoken about it a lot. There's a guy called Wim Hof who's quite controversial, but he's had incredible results in what it's meant to expose people to the cold. But from what I understand, it promotes kind of, I would say, the regulation of your nervous system. It promotes longevity. There's a huge amount of research supporting the the benefits of cold exposure or cold immersion.
Yeah. No, I would love to follow up on that. That sounds just fascinating.
Yeah, Dr. Andrew Huberman has done, I think, more than one podcast about cold immersion. So it all comes down to something called brown fat, which is a kind of fat that you mostly find along your spine, which children are born with lots of it. But because they often grow up in highly, highly regulated environments, it's very seldom that we allow ourselves to really get cold. And as we grow up, the brown fat disappears.
Interesting. So it's a consequence of all of this luxury that we have.
Exactly.
Yeah, that seems like a whole other conversation, Pippa. Right? Well, we'll save that for another one. So tell us about the actual making of the film, because clearly it was not linear.
No.
Craig had, obviously shot a lot of this footage, and I was curious, like, how much of it had been shot, and then, what was done subsequently. So tell us about sort of after the genesis, how did this project actually take shape?
So I had kind of stumbled into this incredible archive of material. Craig sat me down one day and said, look, I want to make a film. For a long time, I thought I'd never make a film again, but I've got this incredible story. And I started looking through the footage and my mind was just blown. And basically, the octopus had been dead for many, many months before I started diving with Craig. But what we had was this incredible archive that he had shot together with his friend Roger Horrocks, who's an world-class underwater cinematographer. And the behavior that they had captured just was utterly mind-blowing. And there were a few, and even in the film, you'll see there aren't that many moments where you have Craig and the octopus in the same frame. So we really had to work with what we had. He was lucky he'd self-filmed some stuff. His son Tom had filmed some of it. Roger had grabbed a few shots. So there was some of that material. What we didn't have at all was any topside footage. We didn't have the interview. And we didn't have any shots of Craig kind of diving on his own. So that was the stuff we started to design those shots around the arc of the octopus's life and the footage that had already been captured.
One of the most amazing moments of that film, I thought, was sort of that first contact.
Yes.
Between Craig and the octopus. That just completely blew my mind, where it sort of tentatively reached out. And, that was just like amazing to watch.
What's blown our minds since the film went out is so many people have contacted us and told us about their own experiences with octopuses and how they've kind of visited an octopus regularly and had a kind of friendship with an animal. And in some cases it was in aquariums, but there have been instances of wild friendships as well. And because the cool thing about octopuses is they set up in a den, and they do generally move at some point, particularly if they go from being an adolescent to an adult and they need more space. But they often go home to the same place every day, so you can visit the same creature.
Yeah, they got a home.
They got a home. And you can go and knock on their door every afternoon.
Yeah, it certainly seemed that way, watching the film. Like, all right, I'm back, my friend. Did it blow your mind when you first saw that? Or had you actually had similar experiences up to that point, like where a wild creature would just sort of reach out to you?
I think, no. I mean, certainly I hadn't thought about it being possible with an octopus. Somehow in our brains, we think that this is the kind of thing that mammals do. But what I've realized in the last 5, 6, 7 years of my career is that you can have a relationship with just about anything. I've had incredible experiences with praying mantises, for example. I've had praying mantises, moving into my house for a few weeks and traveling around on my finger, catching flies off the wall, and being very comfortable doing that. So I think the idea that was possible kind of blew my mind and opened my mind. And now I've just seen instances of it with many different animals, reptiles, fish, cephalopods, mammals, insects. I think they all have a kind of consciousness, and they all can get to a point where they kind of let their guard down. Maybe not every individual, but at least in terms of the different species. I've heard of very, very affectionate relationships between people and lizards, for example, which you would never imagine. But lizards that were very, very close to their owners, and even wild lizards that were happy to be hand-fed on someone's garden wall.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, how did that manifest itself? Like, what did that look like? That sort of emotional connection between like a reptile and a human?
I mean, I don't know, because I haven't gone deeply enough into those stories, but I think what it kind of boils down to is this little vulnerable creature. A lizard is very small. You can imagine what a human looks like to a lizard. Kind of firstly recognizes an individual and learns to trust that individual, and then kind of is happy that that person will feed it, for example, and will realize that they're not going to hurt it, and then we'll keep coming back again and again and again. And in that case, if they're being fed, is it an emotional connection? I'm not sure, but what it is an establishment of trust and an absence of fear and the recognition of an individual human. And all of those things, to me, seem pretty remarkable when we think about what our impressions are of a reptile, for example.
Had you actually thought about, prior to making this film, animal intelligence and emotion in that way? Like, in the way that you're describing?
I had, more in terms of mammals. I hadn't, to start getting into the mind of invertebrates, for example, was not an exercise that I'd ever kind of embarked upon before. Mm-hmm. But it's the most fascinating when you do start trying to get into the mind of an Ehrlich, for example, which is a giant sea snail. And you start thinking, okay, if I was this animal, how would I think? What motivates me in life? How would I enjoy spending my time? What would I be afraid of? How would I know to be afraid of that thing? And they're all quite basic questions, but if you can start to, spend time observing these creatures, and I mean, it's very dangerous, and I'm sure that I will be accused of anthropomorphism. I have no doubt.
Well, I mean, it's hard not to, right? I mean, you're using language to describe something really complex,
exactly.
Right? Such as intelligence and emotion and curiosity and
motivation.
These are the words we have for it. Motivation, like trust, right? These are sort of linguistic kinds of concepts that make sense to us. And I'm reminded, because I'm studying smell these days.
Oh, that is so fascinating.
At the biological level.
Are you looking at ants by any chance?
No, mice. So we're basically, exposing mice to odorants and observing the neural activity. But the reason we're doing that is because, I got into this project a couple of years ago, along with some neuroscientists and through one of my PhD students. And I realized, and the more I thought about it, that smell is hard to describe linguistically. Sometimes it's easy to describe it, but other times you're sort of
very
groping hard to find the right word for smell, right? And that's what made us sort of look at the neural activity as sort of the truth, right? You expose something. How does the animal describe it, right? It describes it in terms of this neural activity is the way we're looking at sort of what I call ground truth. But coming back to your point, right? I mean, it's so hard not to anthropomorphize because you're using language, right?
You're using language, and because we're humans, it's the only frame of reference we have. So we sort of have no choice but to try and project our experience of the world. And neurologically, and you would know this better than I, my understanding is that the building blocks of all creatures are very, very similar. We might be kind of, and I don't even know if this is true, we might be further along in the evolutionary scale than a mouse, for example. But the kind of building blocks of matter that make up what we are and make up how our brains function, they all started in a similar place. That's how evolution works.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because it's really is striking that the building blocks of all creatures are similar, and evidence seems to be suggesting that is the case, right? That
Well, I was going to say, does that mean that the building blocks of consciousness are similar? I don't know. It's a question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, that's a fascinating question. I mean, consciousness is one of those things where we don't have a great theory. One of the questions in artificial intelligence, for example, is whether there's anything innate about life, in terms of these building blocks, or whether it's all learned, right? And the dominant sort of paradigm in AI these days is machine learning, where you give as little as possible to the machine in terms of its internal sort of knowledge, and you have it learn everything, right? So that's kind of the dominant paradigm. But I had a guest last year on the podcast, Tony Zador, who's a neuroscientist. And that was a fascinating conversation, because one of Tony's questions really is, why is it that, given the human genome only contains like 3 billion characters of information, right? And yet the wiring of the brain is so much more complex than that, right? That maybe creatures are actually born with certain sort of capabilities, at birth, because especially after the first few moments of birth for lots of species, that's a dangerous time. And so it's important to sort of have the wiring.
And they jump up and they go.
Sort of leads you in the right direction, away from danger, the kinds of things you're talking about, right? But you were talking about them as sort of being more conscious kinds of things, like, how do I get food, or how do I avoid danger, or how do I decide whether to trust something, right? These seem to be sort of cognitive things.
I don't know if they are.
But they seem to be sort of...
I don't know if they're choices or if they're driven by instinct, but I would say the same for humans.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is like a deep sort of philosophical question, that could get us sort of all the way to whether we have free will, it's that deep.
And I would, I think we have a bit of free will, but I think when it comes to our decision-making processes, about 97% of that is governed by subconscious processes that we will never fully understand. And our prefrontal cortex is controlling the other 3%. And I've been reading about this. I can't even remember where I was reading about it. But this idea that often when we have to make a choice about something, we kind of have an instinctual response. And then our brains were very, very clever in coming up with a rational reason for that gut instinct. So we think it's a conscious decision, but really it's driven by something much deeper.
Yeah, in fact, I might even up that 97% to, 99.99%. In fact, one of my podcast guests who actually has this position that free will exists, because this is like a hotly debated question at the moment. And it seems to be dominated by determinists, right, who say there is no free will. But I don't know, that just doesn't ring right to me for some reason. But I had a guest who said, consider 50-50 situations, right? But it's exactly 50-50, right? Should I have a beer or should I have a Coke? I don't know, just make that up. Like 50-50, right? And what do I do then? And he, so he sort of makes the case that, in situations like that, there's some sort of processing going on, and it may be just totally random, but there's still like a choice. But anyway, that's a whole other subject.
But I think it's quite important when we're talking about curiosity and animal intelligence, because the more I learn about animals, the more I try to understand about how they behave and what might be the cause of that behavior, the more I realize that this kind of myth we've created around human behavior as being motivated by the rational mind has been quite dangerous, because it's created a hierarchy that we think places us above the animal kingdom, and it's not true. And I think we've misunderstood ourselves, and it's created a lot of unnecessary separation between us and all of the wonderful organisms that we share our planet with.
And why is that? I mean, do you think it's basically, what Peter Singer called speciesism, that we just sort of feel, I mean, does it come from Genesis? Is this Western thinking? Like, well, what's your take on this? That do we just feel that the earth is there for our taking and animals are there to serve us? Like, how do you think about the basis for this thinking?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I don't think it's only Western thinking. I think it's extremely pronounced in Western culture, although I think it's being questioned now. I guess because I actually just listened to your Peter Singer podcast, and I 100% agree with him that I think perhaps it comes from scarcity. For example, we are now living in a world that is where scarcity is becoming an increasing problem, and it's making us more and more fearful. And when that happens, you start categorizing who is close to you and who do you want to protect and share with, and who's further away, and therefore you don't have to share with them. And we do that. We prioritize our families, our friends come after that, and then it gets really kind of dark where it starts becoming a question of gender or race. And speciesism is one step beyond that. And I heard a fascinating thing the other day about oxytocin, which is the kind of love chemical that we all think is such a positive thing. Yeah, it allows us to bond with our partners, allows us to bond with our babies. It's also the primary neurochemical involved in discrimination, because that is the neurochemical that allows us to say, I feel close to and I love this person, and I feel further away from that one, and therefore they are not a priority for me. And I will choose to share with my kin over my so-called non-kin.
Pippa, it's interesting you mentioned scarcity, because I often talk about sort of the fact that we are living in an era of abundance, that we've sort of always sort of struggled, there hasn't been enough food, and I remember in my childhood, there were food shortages in India and many other parts of the world. And, that still happens occasionally, but for the most part, like food is more than abundant, right? It's sort of a reason for obesity and diabetes and that's a good point.
Perhaps in America. Yeah. I mean, certainly not in South Africa. There are very hungry people in this country, and I meet them regularly, and you can't help everyone, and it's really distressing. But I think if you go back to the beginnings of human history, I don't think that scarcity was always a thing. I think there was a time where we were nomadic, and when we ran out of food in one place, we just packed up our stuff and moved to the next spot. And I think, from what I understand, that went on from kind of somewhere around 300,000 up until about 10,000 years ago. So for 290,000 years of our existence as modern human beings, we never had to deal with the fact that where we live now, there's not enough food. It was only when we started moving into an agricultural culture where you are storing resources, and then you have to protect those resources. So you need to invent weapons that can hurt other people. You need to start having much bigger families in order to work the land that you live on. Whereas before, having a small family would have been better because you could only travel with so many children at a time.
That's a good point. And also, I stand corrected on the food thing, that it's relative, that, there are large parts of Africa where, there isn't an abundance of food.
And Asia.
But what I was sort of, all over the world. Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, is that true? I mean, do we really have still, and I'm sort of exposing my ignorance here, but I just feel that,
look at what's happening in
terms
Palestine.
of sort of the aggregate production. Yeah. Well, no, that's conflict, right? That is just people killing each other.
I think in most places where you have famine, it's often linked to conflict or aggravated by conflict, or it leads to conflict. But I imagine, I think, no, scarcity is not in modern westernized countries.
Yeah, I guess, what I was getting at was, one of my economist friends describes this sort of as a ratcheting effect, that our expectations and desires keep going up
That's true.
That we seem like we're voracious, like nothing is ever enough, right? It's more and more and more, and to me,
that's a line from my next film. More and more and more. It's one of the opening lines. Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's never enough, and so it sort of just keeps raising expectations, and and now. One of the things that people talk about is that, we're running out of rare earth metals and minerals. Let's start mining the seafloor, right? Let's start mining the ocean floor, for stuff like that. And that just sounds, I don't know, it just sort of makes me shudder. Yeah, scary, right? To think that, and especially, given the film that you've just made, right? I mean, I just can't imagine going in there and just sort of shaking up the entire bottom of the ocean to look for molybdenum or, I don't know, some rare earth metal.
We just don't know.
That goes into driverless cars.
We just don't know what the consequences are. And so often, as humans, we've thought we found the answer. For example, using pesticides in the 70s. And we thought we were doing something really good. And next thing you know, you have a biodiversity crash that's never been witnessed before. And I think AI... we don't know. We don't know which way AI would go, but I think it's a similar conundrum. It seems like it's going to solve all of our problems, but what are the unintended consequences, and where do they lie? And I think deep sea mining. There's a great film called Deep Rising, which explains all of these things.
So I want to come back to this in just a minute, but before I do, I just want to ask you a few more things about the film before we sort of move on to other sort of more general kinds of issues. What were the surprises as you made this? Other than sort of the wonder and the discovery, that you describe in going down there with Craig.
I was surprised at how much I changed in the process. And I guess it does have to do with the wonder and the discovery, but what was most meaningful for me was we pretty much dived in the exact same space every single day for 3 years by the end. And I got to know that place like my back garden. And I started to be able to read the weather and know what would be happening there based on the wind, based on the air temperature. We would have these incredible experiences where huge clouds of jellyfish would drift in at some times of the year. There might be an otter hanging out in a certain place, and then you could go and you could kind of visit him every day. And having a connected relationship with nature like that, what was so surprising for me is how deeply enriching and reassuring it was. And what a relief it was to feel like this kind of very small thing that was connected to something so much bigger and so much sophisticated and complex that I knew I would never be able to make sense of entirely. But it was just wonderful. I was so happy during that time. And we kind of go and have these really, really beautiful experiences and then come back and sit in front of a computer and you're telling a story, but you're also sharing a feeling. And you're sitting at a keyboard and you're, I don't know, like pouring that feeling into the sequences that you're cutting. It was this wonderful alchemical process. It kind of poured through into everyone who worked on the film, my co-editor, my co-director. Everyone somehow got caught up in this beautiful, beautiful feeling. And we all gave way more to the film than we could ever have been paid for. And everyone just did it with absolute joy and generosity, and immensely grateful for that.
So say more about how it changed you. Did you feel that it gave you sort of a new purpose in life, or life had a new kind of meaning? Like, how did it change you more generally?
It gave me a deep sense of belonging, I would say. It gave me a Jane Goodall says something about this, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, but it's something like, I had the deep sense of peace that a person has when they know that they're doing exactly what their purpose is on this earth. Something like, it was just, I guess I was so excited by what I was doing. And I don't always feel like that now. I wish I did. I think there's an irony that comes with success and all of these opportunities opening up for you where you you kind of don't have the time and the space to focus on just one thing with just kind of single-minded purpose like that.
It sounds like a spiritual kind of an experience. I could just as well, if I had sort of turned off the camera, imagine that, that a guru is talking to me about having this sort of
meditative practice.
Yeah, well put.
I think that's what it is. I think when you do something like that, and you have to do it in a disciplined way. That's the irony of it, because it's this kind of free and immersive magical thing, but you have to do it with discipline, like meditation, like breath work. But there is something, and perhaps it speaks to a very kind of primal part of our consciousness that would have spent hours and hours and hours exploring nature, as hunter-gatherers on this coastline 100,000 years ago. But I think meditation takes you into a similar space. I think dance takes you into a similar space. I think that was one of the first ways that we kind of expressed our consciousness as humans. Music. Tracking is a big part of it, and Craig is very, very focused on tracking now. And that is one of the very first skills that we would have learned as human beings, because tracking is all about being able to read the language of nature. And if you could...
Yeah, indeed. In fact, the film starts with that, right?
Exactly.
There's some scenes with trackers in Africa, and he opens with that. So when you say he's sort of more into tracking, say more.
That's a big focus for him now. And
in the ocean?
In the ocean and on land. And it was at the time of the film as well. But when you're making a film, your whole world becomes about filmmaking, and all of the kind of other activities that you love to do fade into the background a little bit. But yeah, he goes tracking just about every day, and he tracks all the time. And tracking is it's a really fascinating kind of storytelling, I would say, because you are looking at signs and clues in a physical environment that allow you to piece the kind of puzzle pieces of a story back together. Can I give you a crazy example?
Yeah, please. I was actually going to ask you, but go ahead.
Okay, so I found this in my fireplace on Saturday.
What is that?
So what it is this kind of grey mass of wax. So it's basically what it is a candle that's been horribly disfigured. You can see the wick over here.
I can see that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I found it in my fireplace, and I was totally perplexed, because the last time I saw it, it was outside on my patio, because I had friends over for dinner the other night and I lit a candle. And 2 days later, it's magically shown up in the fireplace, and it's covered in all these strange kind of scrape marks. It
looks like a meteorite.
It does. Yeah. It looks like a piece of meteorite. It's actually just a very nice scented candle, but it's got all these strange scratch marks all over it. And then I thought about it a bit more, and I realized that when I came home the other day, the outside of my house was total chaos. Because I've got a troop of baboons that visits my property regularly, and they trash the place whenever they can.
And do you talk to them? Quote unquote talk?
I mean...
Communicate with the baboons?
These baboons, it's very important that these baboons stay wild, because I'm sure you know what happens to primates in India when they're not scared of people anymore.
Yeah, no, I actually went to a boarding school with lots of monkeys, so I learned to sort of work with a certain protocol, when it came to monkeys. I used to avoid eye contact, so don't make eye contact, like pretend they don't exist, just go about doing your own thing, and for the most part, they'll leave you alone.
And if you had food?
That was different. Yeah, you don't want to have food.
Yeah.
You definitely don't want to have food around you.
Yeah, so I actually try and chase them away when they come onto my property, because otherwise they will spend the whole day trying to break into the house. Mm-hmm. And stealing food, which is what they did. the other day. I can see all their little handprints all over the windows.
But I didn't mean to distract you, Pippa. You were telling the story.
So I realized, I looked at this candle, I realized it had been on the patio. I had to tidy up everything after they'd been here. And then I realized they stole the candle. They went onto the roof. They chewed on it. You can see all the scrape marks.
Yeah.
And then they threw it down the chimney.
That's hilarious. That they would throw it down the chimney.
They threw it down the chimney. Yep. And that's how it got back into the house. And it took me 3 days.
I guess they felt that they must have felt that that's where it belonged.
Yeah, I don't know what they felt. But I think they were just like, messing with, well, it's fun. I guess it's fun to drop something through a hole. And it took me 3 days to figure that out. I sent Craig a picture and he figured it out literally in 45 seconds.
Yeah.
He took one
that's hilarious.
One look at this, and that's tracking. You look at the scraping marks on the candle.
That's right.
You use your knowledge of baboons and how they behave, and he could just put all the pieces of the puzzle together with almost no clues.
Fascinating. Pippa, how's your life changed since this movie came out? I can imagine there's sort of a pre-octopus teacher and post-octopus teacher to your life, right? I mean, you were a regular person and now you're like highly decorated, like most people I know have seen the movie. And when I mention it, they say, oh yeah, like, and it evokes all kinds of interesting reactions. I mean, I was at a dinner party the other day and someone said, well, it's clear that he was in love with the octopus. And I was like, really? Like, was that, like, why was that clear, And
very strong
and the person said,
feelings.
I mean, there were clearly feelings, but
I
sort of anthropomorphize.
Well, for and I suppose he was in love with her, but not kind of romantically. he had these magical, it's the same as you can have with a friend, I guess, or an experience that when you're having experiences where time stands still, I guess that's what being in love feels like. And romantic love is one of the things that does that to you. But being in the middle of a really intriguing creative process can do that to you too. I'm sure you find that in your work.
Indeed. I mean, that's certainly true. And that's one thing love does to you. There's all kinds of other things
exactly.
It does as well.
Exactly. Yeah, my life's very different. In most ways, it's changed for the better. The opportunities that I have now it's a completely different world. I never dreamed I'd have the kinds of opportunities I have this year. I traveled for 5 months of the year. I work with people all over the world. My team is all over the world, from the UK to the United States to obviously a lot of people in South Africa.
So talk about that. What, when you say your team's all over the world, what kinds of things are you doing now? What's sort of driving you in life?
So I have, I'm working on a new film, about another animal, a very secretive animal that makes no sound, and has a very, very powerful mythological presence. It's an animal that humans have kind of revered and been quite wary of for a very long time. And it's a very strange creature that looks somewhere between a mammal and a reptile, but actually it's just an ancient mammal. One of the most ancient
I'm really
mammals.
Intrigued. I mean, I feel like that, maybe offline I want to play a game of 10 questions or something to identify what this creature is. But
we can do that.
I have a feeling you're not really going to.
We can do that. Yeah, but it's a very exciting project, a lot of work. And nice to have this conversation with you because they're themes that we've spoken about, which I think are going to come through quite strongly in that film. And then I also do a lot of work with the Sea Change Project, which is it was the NGO behind My Octopus Teacher. So we obviously had a huge filmmaking team, and they came on board at different times in the process. And that includes Ellen Windermith, our exec producer, James Reed, my co-director, Dan Schwalm, co-editor, Sarah Edelson, who was our EP at Netflix, our composer, Kevin Smuts, and a film is always made by a village, I guess, like a child. But in the very, very early stages, the project was supported by the Sea Change Project. And we are a storytelling organization that creates projects that connect people to wild nature. And it's very cult forest focused, but we do kind of other projects as well. For example, my new film will also be linked to.
What's the mission of Sea Change?
The mission of Sea Change is storytelling for connection between humans and nature.
As an end in itself, or to facilitate something?
I would say as an end in itself, actually. I think conservation and behavior change come naturally to people who feel connected and in love with the natural world. And perhaps that's a better way of saying it. We want to tell stories that make people fall in love with nature because of the profound change that we've experienced through undergoing that process. Because when you love nature and you understand it deeply, or at least you're on a quest to understand it deeply, you have no choice but to treat it with respect and love and compassion. And that means being aware of the amount of plastic that you consume, being aware of how much you travel. If you're going to eat animals, thinking very, very carefully about the lives that they've lived before they were killed and ended up on your plate. So it's and I think what we've seen, because Octopus Teacher was very, very much aligned with this mission, and we've seen how powerful the outcomes, the conservation outcomes of that film were, the environmental outcomes, and how it changed public perception with regards to octopuses in particular.
I guess the one thing that octopi are probably grateful for is, I'm assuming you've put a damper on the octopus industry.
We have. And I could never eat an octopus because I feel like I have a personal relationship with them. But there's an irony in that, because they're actually a very sustainable source of protein. They grow much faster than tuna or yellowtail or many of the other things that we eat. Reef fishes especially. But what I'm really happy about is that people are no longer thinking of octopuses as this kind of slimy thing that lives under rocks. They now, many people who've watched the film now look at an octopus as a
sentient being.
Clever. Exactly. A clever sentient being with this fascinating secret life.
That makes humans fall in love with it. But coming back to that, I was going to ask you, because one of the other things that came up in the sort of dinner conversation, other than, well, he was clearly in love with the octopus, the other one was like, I wonder why he didn't save her. He could have saved her, but he chose to sort of let nature do its thing, but he'd already sort of interfered with nature and he was already part of it. So, like, what would be wrong with taking the octopus to a safer place and, potentially having it live a longer life and have a deeper friendship with him, right? So that was sort of, I thought that was sort of an interesting question as to, where do you draw the line?
And I don't think Craig knows the answer. I think he's just human, and I think there is some hypocrisy there. And that was actually the aspect of the story that I struggled most with. And it was something that we debated a lot. And I don't think there is a clear answer. I think in Craig's world, he has a lot of empathy for the sharks as well. He knows how much energy it takes for them to keep their lives going. He was very, very grateful that she wasn't killed by a shark. I mean, when she did eventually die, she'd kind of lived her full life and fulfilled her life cycle. But I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't know what I would have done in his shoes. I think it would have been quite hard for me not to save her.
I sort of researched it. Yeah, I researched it a little bit to sort of look, what's the average life of span of the octopus, and it talks about the fact that they usually die after they mate.
That's what happens. That's total normal behavior.
So my interpretation of it was, that he saw that the octopus was mating, and so it was sort of the natural end of its life, and so he didn't feel that. That was my interpretation, was that that it would not have been correct for him.
Yeah, she was all. I mean, it was kind of a mercy killing at that point, because she was. And a very strange thing happened during the making of the film. She was already dead, and I think I'd probably even cut the final scene. But a friend of mine phoned me to say, there's an octopus dying on the beach. And I got in my car and I drove out there, and this octopus had walked out of the water and was kind of lying in this very, very shallow pool, in a very, very small pool, only really the size of the octopus, and she was quite bunched up. And she'd gone pale white, and it was almost like she'd lost her mind. And we went there and we sat quietly and we watched this octopus die. And I felt like it was an important thing for me to experience, given the end of the film and given the nature of the film. And it was a very, very powerful thing. And she was very kind of peaceful. She was just lying in this very shallow puddle, and we probably sat there for 2 or 3 hours. And that was that.
Pippa, has this changed people's relationship with nature, with the ocean, where you are in Cape Town?
I hope so.
Are people doing sort of free diving more? Has it just sort of...
It's exploded. And I don't know if we can give Octopus Teacher full credit for that. I think COVID also was very powerful in motivating people to get outside. But no, the number of freedivers in the water now is remarkable. The most uncomfortable realization, having made the film, is that while it really seemed to resonate, in the people who reached out to us, so we don't know if it resonated with everyone. It clearly resonated with a lot of members of the Academy, for example, but to spend your time like that, to stop working in your chosen career for a while, to take 2 or 3 hours out of your day every single day to go into the ocean, to make that connection. And I suppose it's the same as someone who loves cycling or going to yoga. There's a large degree of privilege that's required in pursuing these kinds of activities. And when it comes to nature connection, it's an added layer of privilege, because you have to be in a beautiful place that has access to wildness. And we're very, very lucky in Cape Town. But in South Africa, there is so much inequality. I mean, it's one of the most unequal places on the planet. And while most people live within a 20-minute drive of the sea, I would say, millions and millions and millions of Cape Townians, they don't have the time, they don't have the financial resources for transport, and they've never been exposed to the ocean, so they can't visit it. They don't visit it, and many people don't know how to swim. Many. I mean, I'm really surprised by the kind of global statistics around how many people can swim. So that was kind of a hard realization for me after my Octopus Teacher.
But that surprises me, that you say that most people don't swim, and even near the ocean. I would have expected different.
And do you think it's different in India?
No, but that by the way is another story entirely. I was in Kerala in the summer, and most people don't go into the water. You know, a lot of people just stand
Why?
and go there for the evening and watch and don't get into the water. That's a great question.
Ask.
That's a great question. And I don't know, because I went into the water, you know, it was beautiful. You know, I was in Kerala. This was in the summer. It was just beautiful, the ocean. And I went in, but most people didn't go in. And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it did strike me that, I don't know, maybe they think it's dangerous. Maybe
But exactly.
maybe it's a custom. Maybe it's just a ritual. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm curious about what you think or what you know.
I think it does come down to culture. If you don't have a culture, you know, even in your family of people swimming and your parents taking you swimming and your parents feeling confident in the water, because the water is very dangerous. The ocean's a very, very dangerous place. In South Africa,
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In fact, I mean, I'm sorry to sort of interrupt, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the way I learned how to swim was my dad was in the pool and he said, "Come on, jump in," right? And I just jumped in because I trusted that he wouldn't let me drown. So yeah, that was my exposure to swimming. I didn't know how to swim. He said, "Just jump in, you know, you'll manage fine."
and you had someone there to catch you. If your dad had been absolutely
exactly.
terrified of the water and unable to save you, he would have spent your entire childhood telling you not to go anywhere near it, because he would have been so terrified of the consequences of something happening and him not being able to help. And I think that's the reality for many people all over the world. I think I read there's a statistic about how many Americans can swim well enough to save themselves, and I think it's less than half.
And what's it like? And what's it like in South Africa with that statistic? Is it similar?
I don't know what the swimming statistic. I looked it up recently, but I don't know what the number is. I'd have to look it up. But I can tell you.
Yeah, I bet it's quite different by race. You know, that's what I would guess.
There are cultural differences that happen in different racial groups for sure, and part of that is determined by cultural practices. What I've discovered in African cultures like the Xhosa and the Zulu culture is the ocean is a deeply, deeply sacred space. And the reason it's so sacred is because very, very old and wise ancestors live in the deep ocean. And that's kind of like their sacred home. And you don't just march unannounced into someone's sacred home. So if you are going to go into the ocean, it's got to be ritualistic. And you say a prayer before you go in, you burn a sacred herb, you ask permission. So that's one thing. Another thing is that the kind of legacy of apartheid and colonialism means that people were often removed from the best parts of the city with the easiest access to the ocean. And while apartheid is over, the kind of social and economic consequences of it are not. And there are still many, many, many poor people who just can't afford to put fuel in their car or pay a minibus taxi to take them and their children to the sea. So I'm really proud of my octopus teacher. I'm really, really proud of the impact it had on the world. I've been blown away by the feedback we received, but there is a slight self-consciousness I've wrestled with ever since around this idea of, you know, you make a film about a super, super privileged white man who is able to spend 2 or 3 hours a day, every day for a year, following an octopus around. And in my world, that seems like a very noble thing to do, because I come from a place where I can choose between doing that or, I don't know, going out to restaurants with my friends. So when those are your choices, spending time in nature seems like a kind of wise and noble, perhaps even sacrificial thing to do. But when your choices are make enough money to feed my children and buy them school uniforms, or maybe I've got to sacrifice the school uniform so I can take them to the beach, you're living in a very different paradigm.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, it was, I mean, he was extremely privileged to have actually had the opportunity to do that and make the film. And it's great to see how and you have actually managed to use it, to bring this kind of awareness and, implement your sort of mission of storytelling and just bringing awareness to the world about nature and just our relationship with animals. And it made me really think more broadly and anew about animal intelligence
Mm.
and curiosity, because I'm immersed in artificial intelligence and I've spent most of my career thinking about algorithms and how to make algorithms more intelligent. And I remember, when I was in my 20s in New York City, I was at a party and a friend said, "Oh, you're studying AI. Why don't you study animal intelligence?" And I just sort of dismissed it. I dismissed the question. And I remember thinking, 30, 40 years later, wow, that was a great suggestion. I just totally ignored it. I should have gotten more deeper into sort of animal intelligence and emotion. But your film really sort of made me think anew about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's really good to hear. I'll tell you a cool story about a friend of mine about AI and cephalopods. So he was a kind of tech genius in his mid-20s, and he made loads of money and sold his company and went to the jungle and in the Amazon and drank a lot of ayahuasca because that was kind of the path he decided he needed to be on. And something that came through in that, because he understood a lot about computers and he was a lighting specialist, he'd come up with this incredible way of using lights in very, very clever ways and partly using, I suppose, early instances of AI to control them. But while he was in the jungle, he got this very clear message about the dangers of AI. And he had this idea at the time that, well, if we're going to have artificial intelligence and artificial kind of computer intelligence, we need an antidote. And the antidote of that would be organic intelligence. And he had this crazy idea of keeping cuttlefishes in giant aquariums and somehow designing a lighting system that responded to the color change in the cuttlefish, and using that as the starting point for organic intelligence.
Fascinating, fascinating. My mind's going in all kinds of directions, including, the possibility of actually animals warning us about existential risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is such a big thing right now, with climate change. I mean,
Really
if there's anything that gets people's attention, it's like, oh, we could get wiped out, right? Until then, people don't really bother. But this possibility of catastrophic climate change and existential risk, makes people think, again about risks. Same thing's happening with AI. Will it cause, does it pose existential risk? Yeah. But I'm just fascinated with the possibility of using animal intelligence to actually give us the warning signs.
And I think there are. I mean, and I think there are kind of. Did you do something about AI and animal communication?
I wish. No.
Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about that because.
We'll save that for another conversation. Yeah. But that is fascinating. Yeah. Like wrap up with one question, which is, what's your advice to young people, looking for purpose and meaning in life?
I guess everyone's different, but I would say if you're going to spend the rest of your life doing something, it better be something that makes you feel happy and makes you feel whole and connected within yourself. So do something that brings you inside of your body, and something that really, really ignites your curiosity. And it could be anything, but don't let outside forces determine what your life path will be, because otherwise it's going to be really, really hard. You're going to feel like you are pushing a rock up the hill if you choose a purpose that is not true to you. If you choose a purpose that is kind of true to your mind, soul, and body, you will have so much energy. It'll be really, really easy to achieve. And create a kind of structure and routine around it. Because I think it's all very well saying, pursue what you love, but if you don't have something systematic that keeps you working at that thing and getting better and better and better at it and going deeper and deeper into it, you're probably going to get lost and lose interest. I think something that the human, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's so well put, Pippa. And actually, it's what you started with, right? It's what you sort of said, that you realized that, when you went in there with Craig, right, that he said there's a system. You've got to have discipline.
And intention.
And I think, and intention, yeah, exactly. An intention and discipline. And it's the combination of that, right? About doing something you really like, but then having that sort of discipline that you pursue, having a system.
Yeah. Because then it starts to feed you. And something that we love as humans is feeling like we're getting better at something.
Indeed. That's something I'm still trying. Pippa, thanks so much for your time in this conversation. I'm a huge fan, and, I look forward to meeting up, face to face, maybe when you're in New York next.
That would be great.
And having several more conversations. There's so much more to talk about.
I'd love to speak to you about scent and visualizing scent, because that's something that I'm trying to do in my next film. Because this animal that I'm looking at, their whole world there is kind of shaped by what they smell, not what they see or what they hear.
Smells intriguing.
Yeah. How to describe that, how to describe that and how to show it in a documentary is quite a challenge. Cool.
Indeed. Well, Pippa, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it. Look forward to meeting up.